Well, good morning.
Good morning.
It is an absolute pleasure to be here. It's been a little while since I've been back to the Unitarian Church, so thank you for the invite. I actually had the pleasure of meeting with Heidi, and she came to one of our faith leaders meetings for the Ogden Civic Action Network. And I think she got me connected to Tim, who then connected me to Tom. And that's how I landed here. Is that about right? Yeah, that's about right. So, maybe we're going to have, yes we are, some slides to assist in this presentation this morning. I am here to talk to you about the Ogden Civic Action Network. And I love the fact that the theme for January is possibilities, because really what I'm hoping we do today is we get to a place where we can start exploring the possibilities of what we can do together to help empower the people of East Central Ogden, give them access to the resources that they need to accomplish the goals that they're trying to accomplish in their lives. So I'm going to be talking a bit about this Ogden Civic Action Network, help you learn a little bit about what that is, how it came about, and why we're focusing on the East Central Ogden neighborhood with our work through this Ogden Civic Action Network, which I'm going to end up calling Ogdencan. And then we'll get to exploring some of the possibilities of things that we can do together. Fortunately, I'm not here by myself representing Ogdencan. I have two of my wonderful colleagues, Bill Cook, you can raise your hand there, Bill, who is the executive director of Ogdencan, and Brian Benyon, who is not only the executive director for Weber Morgan Health Department, but he is also the vice chair of the board of Ogdencan. So you can click. Before I really get into talking about what the Ogden Civic Action Network is, I wanted to point out that the work of this church and the work of Ogdencan are very much in alignment with one another. Tom was gracious enough to pull out 3 principles from the Unitarian Church that he really thinks overlaps, and I absolutely believe overlap with the work that we are doing in this East Central Ogden neighborhood. And the first principle, which I thought was appropriately put up here today, is the recognizing and celebrating the inherent worth and dignity of every individual. That is something that we're really trying to do through this work with the Ogden Civic Action Network. Obviously, justice, equity, compassion, something that draws all of you here to this organization, and it is at the heart of what we're trying to do with the Ogden Civic Action Network. And this notion of using democratic process within our congregations, using democratic process within the work that we do in the community, it's critical. It's fundamental to everything that we're trying to do. So as you listen and you hear and learn a bit about this Ogden Civic Action Network today, you can keep these principles in the back of your mind and think about how these may be informing the work and where we might be able to do some of this work better together. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit of a story, and that will just help you understand where this Civic Action Network came from. Bill always likes to point out the fact that I enjoy context. I'm a sociologist, so I love providing context. And so I'm gonna start by giving you a bit of a story. So in February of 2016, then President Chuck White of Weber State University signed an action statement from the national organization called Campus Compact. That national organization is actually made up of institutions of higher ed across the country, and it's the presidents and chancellors of those institutions that belong to that organization. That organization began 30 years ago, actually, they were celebrating their 30th anniversary in February of 2016, and they wanted to do something, have some symbol that reconnects or reminds institutions of higher ed of their public purpose. Get them recommitted to their communities, to remind them that they are to be good stewards of place. So that action statement that President White signed actually set us up for writing a civic action plan as an institution. But Weber State, being Weber State, situated within this community, feeling one and the same with this community, we decided that we weren't going to write a civic action plan by ourselves, we were going to write it with our community. And so we reached out to Ogden City and we asked, do you want to write a civic action plan with us? And of course they said yes, and we began to dream, and we began to get a little more insight into what it would mean to write a civic action plan. We were encouraged to take an anchor approach and fulfill an anchor mission. Now, anchor institutions or organizations that anchor a community, they're not going anywhere. There are lots of resources, people power, knowledge, expertise, money that flows through these anchor institutions. You don't just pick up a hospital from a community and move it somewhere else. You don't just pick up a university and move it somewhere else, right? The anchor a community. So we reached out to other anchor institutions in our community, and you see them here. The two hospitals, Ogden Regional, McKay-D, representing Intermountain Healthcare, Weber Morgan Health Department, the school district, the tech college, the city, and the university. And we brought those folks together, representatives from those organizations together, and we said, listen, we really think that because we anchor this community, we have a social responsibility to be good stewards of place. How can we leverage our resources to really empower the folks who need it most in our community? And so we developed this Ogden Civic Action Network. And in the process, we said, oh my goodness gracious, if we're thinking about focusing time and energy on those who need it the most and leveraging our existing resources, this is not going to be a one-year kind of experience. This is not going to be a 3-year initiative that's done and all boats have risen in that time and we're good to go. We started to recognize that if we were really to fulfill an anchor mission, each of those organizations, we were going to have to make a long-term commitment. And that long-term commitment is decades. We have to be good stewards of place for decades to come. So we started thinking about how do we go about doing this? And we developed a 4-phase process, basically. In the first phase, we're really trying to organize ourselves, really trying to get trust and social capital identified and coalescing that and bringing it all to the table to figure out what do we have, what are our assets, and who can we bring to this table to work with us. And how do we organize ourselves? I mean, we're talking 7 anchor institutions. We're actually talking allied organizations, nonprofits that are doing the work here in Ogden already. And in the process, we said, oh my goodness gracious, if we're thinking about focusing time and energy on those who need it the most and leveraging our existing resources, this is not going to be a 1-year kind of experience. This is not going to be a 3-year initiative that's done and all boats have risen in that time and we're good to go. We started to recognize that if we were really to fulfill an anchor mission, each of those organizations, we were going to have to make a long-term commitment. And that long-term commitment is decades. We have to be good stewards of place for decades to come. So we started thinking about how do we go about doing this? And we developed a 4-phase process, basically. In the first phase, we're really trying to organize ourselves, really trying to get trust and social capital identified and coalescing that and bringing it all to the table to figure out what do we have, what are our assets, and who can we bring to this table to work with us. And how do we organize ourselves? I mean, we're talking 7 anchor institutions. We're actually talking allied organizations, nonprofits that are doing the work here in Ogden already. And we're talking about residents in Ogden that all need to come to the table. How do we build trust? How do we get folks around the table all rowing in the same direction so that we can make the change that we're all trying to make, to empower folks? So the first phase, from February of 2016 until now, we're still sort of moving out of phase 1 into phase 2. This 3 years now, we have been building infrastructure. We've been building our organizational structure. We've been building relationships and getting ourselves organized. We have 3 implementation teams. I'm going to talk about them in a minute. And they are moving us into phase 2. And those teams are now starting to figure out, well, what are our specific goals, our vision, and what are those evidence-based strategies that we need to put into place in order to address the issues that our residents are facing. And then, in phase 3, we're not there yet, but we will be. We're going to be finding the funding, although we're starting to find some right now. Not as much as we want, but we're working on it. The funding to implement some of those strategies, and then by phase 4, we're going to see ourselves or this organization really positively impacting the lives and transforming the lives of folks in the East Central Ogden neighborhood. So this is a long-term commitment that these anchor institutions in our community are making to Ogden. We had, I told you, phase 1, we really had to figure out how to organize ourselves. So in this phase, these anchor institutions are all sitting around with some of our allied organizations, United Way and Midtown and all of these other organizations sitting around and saying, how are we going to get this off the ground? We wanted to leverage existing resources, and so as a collective, that coalition decided that we would leverage the university's resources. We built sort of a dual coordinating structure. We're using the university's structure to set up and operate Ogden Civic Action Network as its own kind of governing body. So I say this because I don't want you to walk away today thinking this is a Weber State initiative and this is Weber State driven. It kind of grew out of something that Weber State felt like we were committed to, but really the organization that we've created is a governing board for Ogden Civic Action Network that has representation from all anchor institutions, and there are several allied organizations that also sit on that board. We have about 13 board members. Weber State has 2 seats on that board because we act as the fiscal agent. We have our fiscal CFO on the board, and myself. Other folks, they're from everywhere, all of these different anchor institutions and a few allied organizations and the Diversity Commission and NAACP and a wide variety of folks are represented on that board. So Weber State acts as a fiscal agent. We have this governing board. It has a steering committee. It has implementation teams. You see these implementation teams here. There's one for health, education, and housing. Those are our 3 focus areas. I'll talk about those in a little bit more detail in a couple of minutes. But you also see up there an Ogdencan advisory councils, and you see I put the little Unitarian Universalist symbol up there. And the reason why I've done that is because we have several advisory councils to this board. We're working on developing a business advisory council. We already have off the ground, but it's young, a resident council. We have a faith leaders council, and that's what Heidi is participating on, is the faith leaders council. So Unitarian Universalists are already contributing to the work of Ogden Civic Action Network. So where is this Ogden Civic Action Network headquartered? It is headquartered, again, leveraging existing resources in the new Community Education Center downtown, 26th and Monroe, that Weber State just opened November 15th. I believe we had the grand opening. Has anybody had an opportunity to walk into that center? The Community Education Center? No. Yes. Behind. Right. I forget you all are back here. I'm sorry. Yes. So this Community Education Center is the location, it's the headquarters for the Ogden Civic Action Network. Bill's office is there. We're working on a housing study right now with Dr. Jenny Nagy, who's an adjunct professor in economics. Her findings will inform how we move forward on housing advocacy. If indeed we end up with a housing advocate, they would be headquartered there. Our committees will be meeting there. Our board meets there. The residents who come into that Community Education Center are looking for help to access education. These are the same residents that may have challenges around housing, around health, around transportation, around a variety of other issues. So we think that housing the Ogden Civic Action Network in that building is exactly the right spot. And it happens to be located right in the middle of East Central Ogden. So the headquarters of Ogden Civic Action Network is just about in the middle of this East Central Ogden neighborhood, which is the neighborhood we're focusing on. About 20th to 30th, Harrison to Washington, about 10 by 10 blocks. And so it's the perfect spot for the headquarters. We can go. So this place-based strategy, I'm going to talk about why we chose East Central Ogden in a couple of minutes, but I want to help you understand that this is not work that's happening in a bubble. I look out and I see folks like Karen Thurber, who's been doing this kind of work for decades in our community, and you recognize that this is not new. This kind of work is not new, but it is connected to lots of other initiatives that are going on. And recently, there have been 4 initiatives that we are really trying to align because they're all about collective impact. They're all about bringing organizations together so that we can all leverage our existing resources to help particular communities. The orange, yes, orange, I'm from the East Coast, I say orange. I don't know, you all probably say orange. That's really hard for me. Orange. The orange color is that East Central Ogden. That's Ogdencan's focus. But just outside of that, that sort of tealy green color is the Ogden United Promise neighborhood that's been the focus for United Way of Northern Utah. The purple represents 2 zip codes in Ogden that Intermountain Healthcare is focusing on in a new initiative that they have going on called the Alliance. And they are bringing $12 million to 2 zip codes in Ogden and 2 zip codes in St. George, again, to address the needs of folks in some of our most socioeconomically challenged areas. And then that lime green is Weber County. You see Weber County. There's an intergenerational poverty initiative going on that the Lieber Commission is really championing, and that is trying to address intergenerational poverty within the county. All of these groups, we're aligning with all of them. They've all come together and they've said, let's pilot some stuff in that East Central Ogden neighborhood. That's where we all overlap. Let's start there. So we feel like we have the power of coordination and the weight of many different initiatives kind of coming together and zeroing in on a smaller geographic footprint so that we can figure out how to get it right there and then grow it out. So I tell you about the Alliance, the Intermountain Healthcare, the 2 zip codes purple. They're really trying to work with folks who are part of their Medicare and Medicaid patients. And they are taking a new tact. They're starting to focus on the social determinants of health. We spend a lot of money in this country on healthcare. It's oftentimes on fixing people rather than preventing, right? And Intermountain Healthcare has had an opportunity many times over, actually, to lead out and kind of be on the cutting edge of new developments. And they are doing so, again, this time around. They're focusing on social determinants of health. When you look at Scandinavian countries, they are putting more money into things like housing, transportation, food insecurity, interpersonal violence. They're putting more money into preventative elements than they are into fixing people. And so, Intermountain is bringing this lens to the table, to our Ogden Civic Action work, and saying, let's really focus on those social determinants of health. Let's focus on getting people in a place where they're not going to need to be fixed. So, we're focusing on 3 of these areas in particular with Ogden Civic Action Network: housing, health, and education. And as I said, we have these implementation teams that are already at work. They've developed a vision, they've developed goals, and they're in the process of identifying exactly what those interventions need to be in order to create some change for folks who are experiencing housing issues, or who don't have access to health care, or who don't have access to food. So they are putting themselves in harm's way and at risk of other health ailments down the road. So we are working with subcommittees. These are huge subcommittees, by the way. We have almost, I would say, is it about 100 folks? I'm looking still. We have about 100 folks who are serving on one of these subcommittees, or a steering committee, or a sub-subcommittee, or we have a lot of people who are really putting their heads together around these 3 focus areas. So why East Central Ogden? I keep mentioning that it is one of the most socioeconomically challenged areas. And if you take a look at some of these stats, I hope you can see them from the back, you'll see that we have about 15,037 folks living in this East Central Ogden area. That's about 17% of the Ogden population. It is densely populated. It is the most densely populated neighborhood in Ogden. With that can come all kinds of challenges, but it can also come with all kinds of assets. We have a lot of racial ethnic diversity. Almost half of the population living in East Central, Spanish-speaking, or from a Latino Hispanic background. So wonderful, rich culture that lives there, or here actually, because we're in it, lives here, but there are also challenges. We know that most of the housing units are rental units. We know that 100 of them, for example, do not have running water in 2019 in the United States of America, in Ogden, Utah. No running water. not okay. We don't think it's okay. What if everyone had running water, right? So we know that there are some challenges there. We know that life expectancy is shortened by living in this particular neighborhood. The data that I'm showing up here shows 4 years less life if you live in Ogden downtown, but it was a larger area. When you hone in, our newest data are starting to show that when you hone in on just this 10 by 10 block area, there's almost 10 years difference. You're 10 years shaved off your life if you're living in that 10 by 10 block area. So education, we know that education and graduation from high school, it's another one of those challenges that we have in this area in particular. We're lagging behind. The Ogden School District data are showing that even though we're making gains in Ogden School District with graduation rates, we still lag behind the state average. So we know that we have challenges in this particular neighborhood. We want to help folks in this particular neighborhood realize a better quality of life. The data that you're seeing up here right now comes from Dr. Jenny Nagy's research that she's been doing on a living wage. And she is basically showing that 70% of the folks who live in this particular neighborhood need some sort of assistance of some sort in order to make ends meet. That living wage is something that we kind of may or may not think about. We oftentimes will talk about that poverty level, and the poverty level is set so low that there are far more folks who actually might be just above the poverty level, but they're not making a living wage. In this particular neighborhood, 70% of those folks are not making a living wage. So we need to figure out what it is that we can do to address some of those needs. So that gets us to the possibilities. And that's where I'm asking you to think about, well, what can I do? And then that's you individually, active actor, individual agency. But then, what can we do as a congregation? What can Unitarian Universalist Church in Ogden do? And then we can think about what can we do collectively with Ogdencan. So if you're thinking, how can I get involved? What are the things that I could be doing? We have 3 subcommittees, and some of them have sub-subcommittees. And we would love your passion and your compassion and your sense of justice and equity. And we love your expertise and your talent and your knowledge and whatever you can bring to the table, because we know you have something to bring. We'd love to invite you to participate on one of those committees. We would love to ask you, if you live in this neighborhood and you're a resident here, can you help us get that resident council off the ground even a little bit further? Because I feel like we're maybe just this far off the ground with our resident council. Thinking about taking a block by block approach so that each block gets represented and each block has feels empowered to figure out what it is that they want to address on their block, and we want to help them do that. So if you live here, that would be awesome. The Unitarian Church is already sitting on the Faith Leaders Council. That is fantastic. There might be other things that we can do to work together to figure out how do we implement evidence-based interventions to help all boats rise in the East Central Ogden. And Bill, Brian, myself, we look forward to talking with you about that during the fellowship hour. So thank you.